Okay, so this is going to be the turn-based game. This week, I'm actually going to show you the final product rather than code with you this week, because a lot of what I did this week was a lot of aesthetics and just bug fixes, simplifying some stuff. And I feel like it would be better overall to actually explain it afterwards rather than go through it. But so for this week, there's a couple things I added. So as now we have mouse events and stuff. Now if we hover over it, you can see the distance or the range between the player and the enemy, or the health of the enemy as well, which is just a simple variable right now. If we press 1, we see this range indicator. And if we press 1 again, we remove it, so then we can do a different action. So we can cancel and repeat movements again. And then I think the most important one is that since we have mouse inputs and a little bit more of that, we could do something like Fireball, where you pick where you want to cast it rather than it being a particular enemy. So like those are the 3 major things that I did, and I will just go through and explain it. So the first thing I did was I changed some of the names of stuff. So this one was originally like target, projectile, component, action component or something, and I changed it to just auto target, because now you're only targeting pre-existing enemies. And the same with click target, that's just now like the Fireball, for example. And let's show how I did Fireball first. So we simplified it now to where there's now no projectile. Obviously, you can still have one, but if you want. But now what we did, or what I did, was I have this click target action component.js. We have a AOE end, which is false, a spawned AOE, which is initially false, and just a reference to the AOE actual game object. When we start any of these actions, we instantiate a spell range game object, and that is just this thing right here. And this will eventually determine the range of which which enemies can be hit, or the position it can be. So now with this, we added the constructor range. So inside of the spell range game object, it has a range value, which is just added into the spell indicator component, which is just this updating the scale, which we have already done in the past before. So that's already something we've shown with respect to scale, but it's just instantiates that. And then inside of here, what we do is we get the enemies and we call super.start. Technically, we don't need this .targets anymore. So we can remove that because there is no targets. There is only now just where your mouse clicks. And eventually inside of update, we call super.update, which just checks if we end execution. And if we end execution, then we end it. But is execution complete? Now just checks if the AOE is ended. And inside of the actual Fireball, we see if we haven't spawned the AOE. If we haven't, and you press the mouse button down, then we set the spawned AOE equal to true. We instantiate it, and then we set the action AOE equal to the instantiated game object. And we just reference our input.mouse position clone. Now for our Fireball game object. We can just do this. Project that, follow bucket. We just have a polygon component, an expansion component, which is just a simple, I'll eventually change this, but it is just a kind of a simple equation where you just multiply it by some factor, multiply equals by some factor in order to show that it is expanding. And once it hits some sort of duration, then you destroy the game object. but the completed component is the component where it needs to be renamed. So it says fireball completed component. It should just be completed component. But what you do is on destroy, you get the turn manager game object, you get the turn manager component, then you get the current character, then you get the component of the click target action component. So whichever click based action target you're doing, and then you set the AoE end equal to true. So yep. Let's do fireball completed, and let's just rename it. Okay. So now with this, we do the completed component, and I can even a little bit go further. So when we do the get component of the click target action component, since the fireball object or fireball action component is a child of that click target action component, it will be able to get that component. So then we just set AoE equal to true, which, or AoE end equals true, which means that is execution is completed, which means that we call end execution, which calls super dot end execution, which now just calls the active ability equal to null, null can pass turn equal to true, and then this dot destroy. This means also that so that is the fireball change. See, a lot of this stuff is sheerly aesthetic, so technically you could still use your previous input system for fireball. It's just I wanted users to be able to hit multiple enemies if there is like a specific spot type of deal. But that's, as I said, why I'm not implementing this stuff is a lot of this is just aesthetic stuff. So the auto target component was the projectile one, and it is still largely the same. The only major difference is that when you call on destroy, you destroy the spell range game object. But yes, I think the biggest change is the move action component. So if we go to our move action component and we go to our character component, now what I have is inside of stats, I have a max movement, a remaining movement, a max health, and a current health. This is where I'm getting the tech stuff, which I'll show you later on. But basically what I'm doing now is rather than storing the remaining movement from the move action component, I'm actually doing it on the character so that when I move and I stop movement, I can allow the player to move again after ending their movement. What I do for this is that initially I had remaining movement, it's on variable, but then I had to pass it in, and that was a hassle. So instead, I just do put remaining movement inside of the stats component. And yeah, so then whenever I do start, I set the ability cooldown to set. And yeah. So the character component, one thing to note now though is that the character component, the enemy component, and then the player component are three separate things now. So the character component is the parent of enemy component and player component now. So that I can have these functionalities be the same. There's a lot of overlap between the two, generally speaking, with like how the turn-based system works. But in the end, whenever I end my turn, I set the value equal to just the value or the remaining cooldown -1. And then in order to make sure remaining movement is reset whenever you end your turn, you can call this .stats remaining movement equal to this .stats max movement. Yes. And then we can always rewrite this stuff later on. for GameObject.find, turn manager component type of thing. Eventually, but that's for later me. For now, our enemy component. What we have now is if we have an enemy component and that enemy component has a collider, what will be happening is that it will now call on mouse over and on mouse exit. Actually, let's go back to the player component now for movement. So since remaining movement is a required stat now, it will fall under this needed stats. So whenever we add a component, character stats is now in the needed stats, which means that we will have a remaining movement variable that we can set it equal to at the start and then always make changes. So now when we do the total movement change, we just set the remaining movement minus equal the total movement change in x times the distance between the magnitude of the total movement change. So now I can technically change this to dot magnitude, but that's fine for right now. And then what I do then is I get the current game object's character component and then set the remaining movement into whatever the current remaining movement is. And then if the remaining movement is less than or equal to 0, then you end your execution. The way that I can determine if you can cancel something is with this can cancel function, which in this case, movement can always cancel. But for example, inside of the fireball action component, if we go to the click, can cancel is if you haven't spawned the AoE yet. With is execution complete, it just says if when can you actually end this. So this is when the AoE ends, and I can even go to my auto target. Can cancel is if you haven't fired the projectiles yet. And then end execution is if the action projectile length equals 0 and you have fired your projectiles. A lot of this stuff is the same conceptually and can naturally, and again, is more aesthetics of just kind of simplifying stuff. The main difference is that enemy component now, though. So if we go into here, we go into game objects, and we go to our basic enemy game object, now we have a collider. And if we go into our scene, we have two new texts. We have a range text game object and the health text game object. We have a text label, and then we have the start text. This start text is something that I decided to do because there's a lot of times where you have a value label equals a value or some sort. And what I wanted to do is just make an easy way to do it. So what I did was in the engine, I added a component called start text, which has a label, a get value, which in this case I can refactor to just a value. And everything should still work. Yeah. And then I have a set label, which will set the label, a set value, which will set the value, and then an update, which just gets a reference to the text label, which is just the dot text, and then updates it to be this label colon this value. I thought it was common enough that it could be in the engine. You could also just put it in your components. But now what I do is I have a start text label where the label is enemy health and range. And when the enemy component, when on mouse over, we get the player character. And then what we do then is we set the value of the range text game object so we get the component of the start text and we set the value equal to the current player position minus the position of the enemy, whichever this game object is on. Then we get the dot magnitude of it. So it's just one number, and then we fix it to two positions so we don't get too crazy in the math. And then we set the health equal to the current health divided by with a division symbol of the max health. And then on mouse exit, we do the same thing, but we just reset it equal to blank. What else? we can go back to the character component and show you cancel, oh, sorry, the player component. So one issue that was kind of challenging to solve is the canceling of stuff. So if I press 2, I can cancel the fireball if I need to reposition. The way I resolved that in the player component was having this cancel this frame. Every single update, it sets cancel this frame equal to false. And if you activate the ability, we set the cancel this frame equal to true. If so, then yeah. So if we have the key down this frame and that active ability can be canceled, we end the active ability. We set the cooldown back equal to 0, and then we set the cancel this frame equal to true. If it is not canceled this frame, so if cancel this frame is false, then we can actually summon it or activate the ability, and then we set the cancel this frame equal to false. One thing that was happening was that since both of these require the if the keys down this frame equals this dot key, what was happening is if I press the key, it'll go through here and detect, hey, you're pressing this key down this frame, let's cancel it. But then in here, it says, hey, the key down this frame, there's a key down this frame, so let's instantiate it. And there was no matter how you organized it, you are either spawning it and then despawning it, so then you can never spawn it to begin with, or you're despawning it and then spawning it, letting it always exist and therefore not be cancelable. So that's why the this dot canceled this frame was required. Those were the core changes. I think next week when we have collisions, I will actually be able to expand the range stuff. Right now, it just creates whatever the actual width of this is. So when range is incorporated, that'll be a little bit more complicated, which I'll go through it with you. And then I did add 2 components that were very simple, just to show you the power of this, of our now current system, is that if we went to the pummel and we go to player, there. So we added the slash, we have the fireball, we have the pummel. If we press 2 to cancel this and we press the pummel will just be a close range now. And when we actually look at the pummel action component, it is nearly the exact same thing as the slash action component. Just now it's instantiating. They're both instantiating slash. They just have different values now, like a range and targets and max cooldown, to now be able to have a different attack now. So say, for example, this needs to be a high damage attack strike. You can now have that with a close range. Say you wanted a long range snipe, you could copy and paste the slash action component, increase the range to like 1,000, and then boom. Now you have a long range slash, and then you could adjust the damage once we get damage going, which we haven't yet. That will be when collisions and game object hierarchies, or mainly collisions, are good. The other one, which was a little bit more interesting, was the whirlwind. So we go into there, and we go to the whirlwind action component. The difference between this, there's a slight difference, where in this case, rather than targeting at all the enemies, I just wanted to show something different where you could only target yourself. And then what we do is when we instantiate it, that's the same, but one thing that happens is that we don't want it to, for slash action, we call super.start, which does the instantiating and the spell range, but we don't want current select targets, because I felt that since you can only target yourself, that kind of seems redundant, and I also don't want this.train selected enemies. So what you can do is you can just not call super.start, and instead just instantiate the spell range. And then that also simplifies our update, where if the projectile hasn't been fired yet, and the input count equals enter, then we fire it, and then we instantiate the whirlwind, and then we send that projectile onwards. This allows us to do something like this, where inside of our thing, if I click 4, and you see that little tight circle around us, we click enter, and then that's our whirlwind attack that will hit anyone who's close. So now as you see this, you probably see why I made the distinction now between auto target and click target, is because a lot of the times you can have this AoE explosion, but it could already pre-exist on yourself. So having that AoE projectile didn't really make full sense. But now having separated as click target action component and auto target action component makes it a lot more easier generally to do so. That was probably the most of it. I will be making my GitHub repo public now, which is nice. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, you could always email me, or you could also access the GitHub repo now, which will have all of these changes that you may be able to look at more in depth now. Hope this helps. Kind of show you I'd probably say the most important part, specifically from this week, was the enemy component with the on mouse over and on mouse exit. And then, and one other thing we can actually show you now is the click target, or fireball action. One thing we cannot do is use on mouse. It was in our engine scene, on mouse up as button or on mouse down. We cannot use on mouse down or on mouse up as button, and the main reason is because since we could click anywhere with our fireball, there's really no game object that is everywhere. So for this fact, we can't have a collider on it to then detect collisions. So you have to manually detect on mouse down, which is why inside of our fireball action component, I do input.mouse button down this frame includes 0. So I hope that kind of understands it, but I would say the key important thing for today anyway, for this video, is just how to use the mouse stuff, because a lot of the other stuff was just really aesthetic type of things. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you could always email me, or again, look at the repo code, because I will be making that repository public.